The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good comrades, good people, wherever you are in the world. I am Jamilah, and I am an organizer with the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, of which we are presenting this podcast to you, the Pantsula Podcast. The objective of the A-APRP is a unified socialist Africa under scientific socialism. If you have any questions about what that means for us and the world, you can contact us, as well as go to our website, aaprp-intl.org. Before we move on to our episode, it is crucial we honor our ancestors, because it is them who laid the groundwork for what we do. Without them, there is no us. For this episode, we are honoring Elma Francois and Eduardo Mondlane. Elma Francois was an anti-colonialist organizer based in Trinidad and Tobago. She was the founder of the National Unemployed Movement, or the NUM, which was later known as the Negro Welfare Cultural and Social Association, or the NWSA. In 1935, it was this organization that, in response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, held a mass workers' protest and boycott, preventing Italian ships from docking. Following the oil-filled riots of 1937, where oil workers revolted as a result of labor organizer Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler's arrest, Elma Francois led a workers' strike in the port of Spain, Trinidad, in 1938, where in turn she was arrested. She defended herself in the trial and was found not guilty. She went on to form organizations such as the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union, or the SWWTU, and the Federated Workers Trade Union. Eduardo Chivambo Mondlane, that's the other person we're honoring, from 1962 to 1969, he was the first president of Frelimo, or the Mozambican Liberation Front. He was the author of Luta por Mozambique, or the Struggle for Mozambique. Prior to his role in the fight for the independence of Mozambique, he was employed at the United Nations, as well as a professor of anthropology at Syracuse University. It was in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, where Mondlane and a group of comrades formulated the groundwork for Frelimo. In 1969, Mondlane was assassinated, immediately killed by a bomb inside of a box he opened. His murderers have yet to be identified. Ashe to our ancestors. Again, it is without them, we would not be doing the work that we are doing today. And with that, we are now prepared to do this episode. Yay! So in addition to organizing with the A-APRP, I also organize with our guest, Margaret Kimberley, in the Black Alliance for Peace, or BAP. Margaret Kimberley is a co-founder and executive editor and senior columnist for the Black Agenda Report, which is actually where I first became familiar with your work, Margaret. And Margaret has contributed writings to Hood Communists, as well as Capitalism on a Ventilator, the Impact of COVID-19 on China and the US, and Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. She participates as well in content for the Left Lens YouTube channel. The analysis that fuels her writing is also evident in her organizational work with the United National Anti-War Coalition, the Black Alliance for Peace, as mentioned, the Green Eco-Socialist Network, and the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. She is also a person I aspire to be like when I grow up, and I mean that sincerely. Welcome to the Pantsula Podcast, Comrade Margaret. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. You make me sound so impressive. I don't feel very impressive sitting here in my pajamas, but at any rate, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So tell us your origin story. What was the foundation for your ideological development?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'd say it came from my parents. My late parents always encouraged us to be knowledgeable about Black history, to be knowledgeable in general, to know what was going on in the world. That foundation is one that has been with me my whole life. My ideological grounding started with Black Agenda Report, frankly. When I first started writing for our team, our founders, myself and the two late co-founders at Black Commentator, Glenn Ford in particular, who passed away nearly a year ago. He is the person I would say he was my political educator, if that's a term. Meeting him, writing with Black Commentator and then Black Agenda Report, all the other people, movement folks that I met, starting with that from literally all over the world. I would say it's a combination of my upbringing and then choosing to work with and have a comrade in Glenn and others like him.
Comrade Glenn was definitely a strong figure. And one of the most memorable moments I would always show to people is the Democracy Now! Debate, I guess if you want to call it, that was had in relation to the Obama administration. I'm sure you remember that very well. His astute critique of the Obama administration and the imperialism that comes with the US. I think that was absolutely a strong introduction if people were not familiar with him at all. So him being an ideological teacher to you, that's that's some strong teaching.
Well, if people have the chance, your listeners have the chance, they should look up the debate you're referring to is debating Michael Eric Dyson, who is, Glenn called him a wall of sound, just a lot of hot air, but the kind of person who I guess because he is just hot air, makes the right connections. He gets book deals, he's on TV, but he really doesn't have anything to say. He's a rank opportunist, and Glenn wiped up the floor with him. So it was epic. And I urge people to go on YouTube and look it up. It's worth watching.
It really is.
All these years later, it still is.
It really is. So with all those teachings, with everything that was laid for you in terms of a groundwork, what was a definitive moment for you where the analysis clicked? I know there's a general way to have the analysis taught to you and come into your life, but was there a moment where it clicked? Was it an interaction you had? Was it a chapter of a book you read? Or was it just your experience beginning to write with Glenn Ford? Was it something he specifically said to you? What was that moment?
I can't think of one moment. I can think of some, which I'll tell you about, as a result of becoming a Black Agenda Report columnist. I began to make contact with people in other organizations, anti-imperialist organizations. I had the opportunity to travel out, to be invited outside of the country. And there's something about seeing the rest of the world, even though I had done it before in my youth, but I had not done it after getting myself right politically, if you will. And to see places that are vilified by the US. For example, I went to Nicaragua last year. I'm going again soon as part of a delegation, a Black Alliance for Peace delegation. It was one of many who traveled to Nicaragua to be election companions. They did not use the word observer because that can be used in nefarious ways. But I obviously did not, as an anti-imperialist person, believe what I was told about the Nicaraguan government. It's another thing entirely to see people struggling in a revolutionary way with the government that's been under attack by the US for 40 years, starting with Ronald Reagan and the so-called Contra War, where they poured money into the country and destabilized the country, killed thousands of people, mined their harbors, all in an effort to keep this little country. Nicaragua now has 6.5 million people. There are more people in New York City than there are in all of Nicaragua, but it tells you what this country is about, that no stone is small enough to be unturned, and try to destabilize. The US was always, continues to interfere in their country. The Sandinistas lost an election. They were out of power for some years, but were elected again. it was easy to see they had the support of most people. Everything we're told is just such a blatant lie that other parties had the opportunity to campaign openly, but people still reelected Daniel Ortega as president. So that's an example of a moment where my understanding, you make a big leap in understanding when you see something for yourself. But I would say more than anything, it was a process of many years to increase my knowledge. And I used to think of myself years ago, I thought of myself as being a left person, but reality was I was just a liberal, and I had to educate myself to be a real anti-imperialist, to really understand what socialism can do for the people, to really see how unreformable our system is, how unreformable our government is, to say that I don't have to vote for these people, actually not don't have to vote for these people, but I should not vote for Democrats either. And to see how that they are the obstacle, that they are the problem, and this phony allegiance and falling for this belief that they are the lesser evil. Glenn used to say they're just a more effective evil. So I would say it was more of a process, but I would say you reach a point of greater education by being involved with other people. You have to have solidarity with other people. You can't by yourself gain this understanding, even if you're by yourself and read, all the right books or anything. It's being in struggle with other people, encouraging other people, being encouraged by other people. And I would encourage anybody who's listening to expand your horizons, to do things you haven't done before, which is not comfortable in the moment, getting out of one's comfort zone, but it is so worthwhile. It makes all the difference in the world. And, when you start something new, whatever that may, like starting writing, start writing for Black Commentator. And Glenn he was funny. He would warn me. He says, I know you say you're going to write every week. He says, but it's really hard to write something every week. But the end result of doing that, of stretching beyond what I thought of as limits, was that I am, now a published author. I would say it's a process, and I think that's just fine. That can be different for everyone, but I would say join an organization. That's very, very important. Take the opportunity to go to conferences or teach-ins or webinar, everything. Unfortunately, the last 2 years has been too little personal interaction, but I think we need to get back to seeing people face to face.
I want to say, before I ask this question to you, one of the first memories of me building an analysis, you talk about Nicaragua, my mother had the TV on a lot, and in the kitchen, it was a small TV, and the Iran-Contra hearings were on, and I just knew that there was something wrong with this country. I had no idea about half the things they were saying, but there was something that did not sit right with me. And so I always say that it is Ronald Reagan and the Sandinistas that help to fuel my analysis about everything that's going on. And again, I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't particularly know who the Sandinistas were, but in the whole context of things, if we look at everything dialectically, I have to thank Ronald Reagan for that. And I have to thank the Sandinistas for that. So thank you both. And my question to you, because you mentioned liberalism and how you had a shift from being a liberal to an anti-imperialist, in your journey with that, what would you say that being a liberal comprises of?
It's a good question. I think it amounts to thinking the system is okay the way it is, that you want changes, that everything's not all right, that some things are very wrong, but you think a little reform here, a little change there, if only this person was in office instead of that person. It's bereft of any analysis of what the system is like, how it got to be the way it is. Why is there anti-imperialism? Why is there neoliberalism? All of those things go into liberalism. But I also, having said that, want to say people are liberals because they're miseducated. For example, when we're taught about the liberation movement, what people call the civil rights movement, we're told it's this high watermark for Black people. And there were many successes, many gains that the whole country benefited from. But it all happened because of struggle. Even, Martin Luther King was the product of a movement. There was a movement in Montgomery before he arrived. Everybody that we revere, rightly so, they're the product of a movement. They're the product of other people's struggles. They're the product of their own struggles. So it's very important to know that kind of thing. So every year on King's birthday or, some anniversary event, that we have that era elevated to our consciousness without being told about how it was a mass movement. It's Black people in the South who couldn't vote, who got voting rights for everybody because they made constant demands on the system. They made demands they knew the government didn't want to meet. They were not wedded to the Democratic Party. They were wedded to liberation. But when you don't know all of those things, that's where the liberalism comes in, that it's some individuals and it was a good president, LBJ, he, was a nice man and worked with King, and you don't have that analysis. So it's not having analysis. It's the influence of corporate media, of our educational system, all of those things combined together to create some of that confusion.
You are a published author, as you mentioned, and you wrote the book Presidential. I want to discuss something you wrote in the epilogue, and I have follow-up questions there. You talked about how Donald Trump is vilified because his open racism tarnishes the brand. You talked about how the system depends upon this capacity to make people feel good about their country and themselves. You wrote that Trump makes that difficult, instead embarrassing people who want to have positive feelings about their government. What was once a dark underbelly is now the very face of the US government. Trump's racism gives people who previously kept their opinions private a certain level of comfort. Now they have no reason to hide and, in fact, are encouraged to flaunt their ideology. On August 12th, 2017, a group of white supremacists gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia, to protest the planned removal of a monument dedicated to Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The march was not confined to support for Confederate monuments. Armed militia accompanied self-proclaimed racists and white supremacists. Donald Trump's election was a catalyst for these protests, and he won the election because he reads white Americans so well. He is the everyman, albeit wealthier. He says what they say. President George Washington was a slave owner, so will George Washington lose his status? Are we going to take down statues of George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? Do you like him? Because he was a major slave owner too. Are we going to take down his statue? End quote. The book covers every president up to Donald Trump in relation to the vilification of Trump for his contribution to and representation of the erosion of the notion that America's relationship with capitalism and white supremacy could be tweaked and repaired. So that's referring to your comment on liberalism. Joseph Biden has had a long documented history of his support and composition of racist and imperialist policies, tracing back to his position as senator in the 1970s. What contradictions have you seen in terms of the rationalization for support of Joe Biden despite this history?
Well, that's where the liberalism comes in and the miseducation of people. I wanted to add one more thing to what I was saying. We're also not taught that the liberation movement was crushed deliberately by the state. That's something to always keep in mind. Biden, yes, the man who told the corn pop story, the man who shepherded the crime bill through the US Senate in the 90s and put so many Black people in jail where some of them still remain, yet he is defended and supported. And it's a couple of things. This country has, and I suppose it's inevitable, there's a white people's party and a Black people's party. And the fact that Black politics, and by that I mean politics that asserts the needs of Black people, because Black politics are so weak, we seem to think, or we're told all the time, that the best we can do is keep the white party out of power, that's all we can do is keep Republicans out of power. And it doesn't matter how bad Democrats are individually or as a group, we are convinced And, and that convincing is done quite deliberately. That's all we can expect, that there is a lesser evil. And the only thing we can do, despite the fact that we're told this is a democracy with limitless possibilities, when it comes to politics, we're told all we can do is vote. And all we can do is keep those bad people out, keep them away. And so when the first Black president, and that's a whole other story, engineers, and that's exactly what happened, Biden getting the Democratic nomination, most people are in favor. And if anybody asked a question about the process, about Biden himself, we were told, well, Trump, 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 you got to get rid of Trump, and Biden is harm reduction. And sometimes the propaganda even tells you, yeah, we know the system's crappy, but it's slightly less crappy if you have this group of people instead of that group of people. So we end up with Jim Crow Joe, as he is known. We end up with him in the White House, so he signs the bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday, which is frankly itself problematic. I know we just had Juneteenth, and I think that the memory of those events were harmed by making it a federal holiday, quite frankly. People feel stuck because we are indoctrinated. We are propagandized. We are told, on the one hand, that America is such a great country, but not when it comes to politics, because you don't have many choices. It's either this or that. And if you don't vote for these horrible people, then it's your fault that Trump won. And so that's how Joe Biden got to be the president. And even when he shows himself to be this, unreconstructed old racist, I don't know if you remember, after when he was president-elect, sometime after Election Day, November 2020, he had a meeting with people who have been labeled as civil rights leaders. And the video of the meeting was leaked, thank goodness. And you saw how dismissive he was, how rude he was to Black people who made, rather tepid remarks and made requests for things that were quite reasonable. He just insulted them, and, he says, I mean what I say. And if you don't like what I say, well, then to hell with you. I mean, it was literally, that's on YouTube too. You can see that. But still, it was, that's just what Joe's like. And so here we are with this horrible man with a horrible party. The Democrats are the party of neoliberal austerity, the party of imperialism. He included in the federal budget a request to give police $30 billion more. Police don't need any more money. So much for, expecting defunding or reallocation or anything of that kind. So we end up with this person, but still the average, especially the specter of Trump, I feel like sometimes I've said jokingly, the Democrats must have created him. He's their go-to guy. And they feel they don't have to do anything for anyone except say the word Trump often enough. And Black people in particular will accept just about anything, which is really quite tragic.
All the things you mentioned leads to this question. And it also stems from something you said earlier. What's the importance or primacy of political education? What does that hold for you?
That's a good question. I just think it's important to know, first of all, you should know what you're talking about. You should be able to defend what you say. If you can't defend it anymore, you have to think about, okay, I need to make a change here, but what's that based on? And if you don't have history, if you don't have analysis, then you're really lost, and you can be carried off in any direction. So I thought it was kind of funny when you said, watching the Contra hearings, led you in the right directions, even though you weren't quite sure what it was you were seeing. That's the kind of thing that political education will do for us. If you do have a grounding of political education, then you're not going to be swept up in some nonsense. And it's important to know what's going on, to be aware, to know why certain things are being done, to know why right now the United States felt a need to try to weaken Russia and why they are failing in that effort, and to understand why these advanced countries are following the United States over a cliff and harming themselves and the rest of the world. And why have, despite having this situation in Ukraine blow up in their faces, the Biden administration is now trying to start something with China, trying to turn Taiwan into the new Ukraine. So when you have that political education, and that's a process. It's never, nobody should ever think that there's a point where they have every answer and they know everything. And that's the other thing about being in political education with other people. Then you learn from other people. One person falters, another one is able to stand up. You don't know something, but someone else does. So that's the importance of solidarity as we work to educate ourselves and to move forward. But it's really vital to understand why to have a basic idea of why things are happening the way they are happening, instead of saying, why is there, it's a conversation I had a couple years ago. Yeah, it was pre-pandemic. It's funny how we have this dividing line in time now, right? But someone said to me, why do they have gig work? It makes people's lives so insecure. And I said, well, that's the purpose. That's the goal, is to make your life insecure. But that's what political education does for us, that we can see things more clearly and things are less mysterious to us, even if we don't know every fact, if we don't know as much as another person. It gives us that basic understanding, that basic grounding of where we are as Black people, and an idea of what it is that we need to be working on.
I would love to talk with you about your experience in Nicaragua. There were the recent elections in Nicaragua, as you mentioned. There were the elections that just happened in Colombia. And then we have what is called the Summit of the Americas. So of course, there were particular countries that were barred from participating in the Summit of the Americas. So I want to get a little bit into that and the protests from other countries as a result.
Yes, the Summit of the Americas is, as the title says, is supposed to be a meeting of every country in this hemisphere, from Canada down to Chile and Argentina, every country in between. Unfortunately, though, the US was the host country and the summit took place in Los Angeles. But the US, being the US, decided to ban Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Now, first of all, the summit doesn't belong to the US because it's in the US, but that's US arrogance and stupidity. So instead of leaving it alone, instead of letting these leaders who are the sovereign heads of states in their countries, instead of letting them attend the way they attend every other summit of the Americas, the Biden administration said they can't come, and they can't come because they're not democratic. Now, meanwhile, as people pointed out, the new prime minister of Haiti, who may be implicated in the assassination of the last president, and who is the prime minister because the core group of the US and France and the EU and Canada all decide what happens in Haiti and not the Haitian people. He was invited. There's nothing democratic about the way Haiti is being run because it's a US colony. So we know right away that's an example of how bad a lie that is. But of course, it's awkward if you say the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, isn't really the president, and this guy Juan Guaido is, and you have kidnapped a Venezuelan diplomat, Alex Saab, who had diplomatic immunity, or should have had diplomatic immunity, but is in a prison in Florida. When you do things like that, I suppose it is kind of awkward to let these leaders attend. When you are still maintaining sanctions against Cuba, actually go backwards in time. Obama reestablished diplomatic relations. There was some degree of change as travel regulations and so forth. Biden went back to, and then Trump undid that, and then Biden stuck with Trump. And you see Biden once again making Trump foreign policy his foreign policy and being dedicated to sanctioning the Nicaraguan government. So I guess it is kind of difficult to do that. But of course, what happened? Well, the summit was a failure. So this big PRX, and that's essentially what it amounts to, they screwed it up for themselves. By excluding those countries, they raised the ire of other countries. 6 countries didn't show up at all because of the exclusion of those states. And those who did show up mentioned the exclusion publicly. In the media, there were journalists, people doing the real work of journalism, had the opportunity to ask the Secretary of State to put him on the spot and others on the spot. So the summit was a failure, which is a good thing because it exposed the United States. There was a counter summit, a people's summit. Black Alliance for Peace participated in some of those events. There was an anti-imperialist summit, and I urge people to look on the Black Alliance for Peace YouTube page and Facebook pages, and you can see the panel discussions that were held, hosted by the Haiti and the Americas Committee. By taking those actions, the U.S. brought renewed attention to its illegal actions against these countries, the sanctions that are literally killing people. Other countries who would have shown up and not said anything felt compelled to publicly disparage the United States, which is all good, as I said, but I guess that's part of the dialectic too, right? So the summit was fortunately a failure for the US, but it shows you what happens when the US continues to think it can get its way in the world. So they sanction Russia, which hurts the entire world. There is this economic war of attrition going on, which is victimizing many countries. Last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, the chairman of the African Union met with Vladimir Putin. Why? Because when they kicked Russia out of the SWIFT system, the international monetary transaction system, that meant African countries couldn't pay for the grain they buy from Russia, for the fertilizer they buy from Russia. And European countries who, as I said before, are following the US over a cliff, now don't have the natural gas from Russia that they need. So Germany, which was bragging about clean energy, is now going back to coal, which is a lot dirtier than natural gas. So you can see how the US with every step undermines itself. And this illusion, this delusion that the US can continue to run the world is being exposed. So I digressed a little bit, but I think those are the most important things to know about the recent Summit of the Americas.
The US is the very textbook definition of narcissism. And one of the qualifications of that is, if I'm going down, the rest of you are going down with me. One of the things that came out of that in other recent news, there is HR 7311, the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act. And that was sponsored by Congressman Gregory Meeks, a Democrat based in New York. And it is an act, quote, to direct the Secretary of State to develop and submit to Congress a strategy and implementation plan outlining United States efforts to counter the malign influence and activities of the Russian Federation and its proxies in Africa and for other purposes, end quote. And this is a multi-level discussion because it connects capitalist appropriation of representation. It connects the imperialist core's obsession with obliterating socialist and communist movements around the world, as we saw with the Summit of the Americas, as well as the interest in upholding control over the African world, not just the continent, but in places like Haiti as well. So I'd like to begin with a brief history of the US's involvement in assuring the people's self-determination in Ukraine, how that was minimized. So there's Project Aerodynamic, and that was from 1953. So people are talking about what's happening today, but there's Project Aerodynamic. There's a memo, which you can see on the CIA.gov website. It's on there. And there's a memo from August 28th, 1953, and they talk about the purpose of Project Aerodynamic is to exploit the anti-Soviet Ukrainian resistance group in Western Europe for intelligence purposes. So those groups are the Ukrainian Supreme Council of Liberation, or the UHVR, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or the UPA, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the OUN, and the foreign representation of the Supreme Council of Liberation was also utilized, the ZPUHVR. The other thing about this, it says, Project Aerodynamic originally approved on the 31st of June, 1951 as a joint FIPP operation. To date, the project has been successful in dispatching agents into Ukrainian SSR and has established with contact with 2 of the agents dispatched. The field of intelligence procurement has been limited to situation reports and a few items of military importance. 3 SO, and there's a lot of acronyms here, SODBs have been disseminated. Present plans call for the continued training of 3 agents, recruitment and training of 3 additional agents, and the utilization of 1 agent spotter in Western Europe. Agent training is being transferred from Germany to the DOB. Detailed COMO and logistical annexes are attached to the project outline. Again, this is a 20-page memo from the CIA talking about destabilizing any sort of democracy in the Ukraine or Soviet influence. So anything that is in existence now has been in existence for a long time. The role of NATO was to destabilize Soviet influence around the world. I was 15 years old when the USSR fell. So I was alive when that happened. NATO did not dissolve. There's actually footage of Joe Biden in the 80s talking about the hope for the expansion of NATO. So Joe Biden is all up in the grill of Europe, and people cannot decide for themselves, decipher for themselves what type of self-determination they would like to have, because the imperialist court is all up in the grill, making sure there is no self-determination. So there's lots of these documents. There's a document from 1960 you can see on the government website in regards to how Cuba was destabilized and how they wanted to install a coup there and how they wanted to starve the people out because they were for the revolution. So these things aren't just coming from us just because. There's actually sufficient evidence showing you that the US totally has plans to destabilize any socialist or communist movements around the world. So again, we're talking about political education. This is an aspect of it. So there's also a CIA document from August 1975 on nationalism in Soviet Ukraine. So again, this is nothing new. There's the 2014 coup in Ukraine, and there's audio discussing, hey, these are the people we want to put in. These are the people we don't want to put in. There's audio about this. And so this was supported by NATO and the US. HR 7311 is a continuation of this story. It shapes perpetual Red Scare tactics. So I would love to discuss that with you right now.
Yeah, the first thing, and the anti-Soviet elements were all neo-Nazis. You know, they're trying to hide the Nazi origin of much of Ukraine's leadership. Ukrainians, it's a long story. We don't have time to go into it. There's history of historical grievances. Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, became part of the new Soviet Union. There were elements in that country which did not want to be part of the Soviet Union. There was a man named Stepan Bandera, who is, by the way, celebrated in Ukraine now. The genocide against Jewish people was carried out with the help of many Ukrainians. There are neo-Nazi parties in Ukraine. There's the Azov battalion in Ukraine. And they recently, it's very funny, they tried a little PR makeover. They were saying, well, this isn't our logo anymore because it looked a little too Nazi. So we have a new logo, as if that changes things. So at any rate, in the early 50s, these are the people the US was working with to try to destabilize the Soviet Union. Biden was the point person during the Obama administration, the Ukraine point person. And we know about his son, his dumb son, even got a position on the board of a Ukrainian gas company, being paid $50,000 a month to have the last name Biden. He didn't do anything. But I'm digressing a little bit, but he was the Obama point person, and we have to say it was Barack Obama who facilitated the 2014 coup against the elected president of Ukraine on behalf of right-wing forces. So this was a continuation, as you point out, of many decades of US efforts to destabilize that country. And the Biden administration came into office determined to try to sanction Russia. Germany had a gas pipeline project, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and the Biden administration goal was to kill that and to sanction Russia and to try to destroy the Russian economy. Why? Because Russia is an independent nation and acts like it. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was in the 90s, it was like the Great Depression, but only worse. I mean, the life expectancy dropped, that people were poor, the country was robbed by oligarchs, all of which was fine with the US. And when Yeltsin was president in the 90s, that's just what the US wanted Russia to be. Putin was his hand-picked successor, but in the irony of history, he said, we're not doing that anymore. We hear all the time about Russian oligarchs. Putin is the one who got them out of politics. And that, they have very wealthy people in Russia, but we have an oligarchy worse than anything that Russia has today. But at any rate, so this effort to destabilize using former Warsaw Pact countries or former Soviet republics continues until this day. There was a regime change effort against Belarus last year, another former Soviet republic, which remains closely allied with Russia. All of that was cooked up by the US. So Biden comes in, wants to, as the Secretary of Defense said, weaken Russia. So they encouraged the government to try to take back the Donbass region, which, by the way, this war has been going on for 8 years. This is not the first time that people died in war in Ukraine for the last 8 years. The Donbass region, which rejected the coup government, has been fighting against it. And the Biden administration hoped to instigate some small war. He actually said this himself. It's a funny thing with Biden. He blurts out things that presidents aren't supposed to blurt out. But if you pay attention, he's telling the truth with his little indiscretion. So in January, he said, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. Russia's evil, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, but if it was just a little incursion, it wouldn't be so bad. That's what they hoped. They hoped to instigate, and they were attacking the Donbass, daring Russia to get involved. And if Russia were involved, then they could hatch this plot for sanctions and killing the pipeline deal. Except Putin changed all that. He said, in for a penny, in for a pound, and began what they are calling a special military operation, which Russia is winning. I touched on the damage that the sanctions have done to African countries, but that's true of the whole world. This idea that Russia, all they have is gas and they don't have a big economy is just a lie. The ruble, they thought they were going to turn the ruble to rubble. I think that's what Biden or one of his people said. The ruble has actually gone up in value since February. They can't get countries to go along and harm themselves as part of their goal to harm Russia. So as I said before, everything they do to try to undermine Russia, they undermine themselves. And one example is India. India was buying oil from Iran, and the Trump administration, in their effort to destabilize Iran, pressured India to stop buying oil from Iran. So what happens to this cheap source of oil that India had? China moves in and gets it. So the Indians have egg on their face. They don't have the source of oil they used to have. China came and got it. So this time around, the US comes back and says, oh, stop buying Russian oil. And India said, thank you very much, but we're going to buy oil from wherever the hell we want. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that's an example of what they have done to themselves. You now have countries refusing to go along. So they can win a vote in the UN condemning Russia, but a lot of countries abstained because they have relations with Russia too. So we see a system that is undermining itself. It's like a snake eating its own tail, or that's the image that just came to my mind. So that's a quick and dirty history of Ukraine, except to say Ukraine is losing. Russia is winning the war. Ukraine is never going to be the country it was before February. Why would Russia go through this and then leave? So the country has now lost a huge amount of territory. All they have is propaganda, blue and yellow flags. You can't turn on the Grammy Awards without seeing Zelensky. That's all they've got. But if you'll notice, if you're paying attention, you will see they're trying to walk it back. So now they're throwing Zelensky under the bus. It's like, well, they didn't share their intelligence with us. And Ukraine is a US colony. Zelensky does whatever the US tells him to do. Now they're trying to walk it back because Russia is winning. Russia has cut ties with the West. As far as they're concerned, they intend to do it for good. They were willing to negotiate, but the US told Zelensky he was willing to make concessions. The US told him not to. So Russia has had it. This is going to go on for a while, but the old Ukraine is never coming back. All this talk about sending the military equipment is a joke for a couple of reasons. One, their casualties are so high, their military has been decimated. And I'm learning, I've become the Ukraine war nerd. A lot of military equipment, it takes time to learn how to use it. It may take weeks or months to be trained in order to use it. So all this talk about we're going to send Ukraine this or send Ukraine that is a joke. It's not happening. We're going to see more walking back, and we see, what do they say, Putin's price hike. So the price of gas is going up. They've shot themselves in the foot, and instead of just doing something, anything to help the people, they're trying to depend on propaganda. And this is not going to save Biden and the Democrats in the upcoming midterm elections. That was a long story, although it is a long story, and I hope that all made sense.
It made absolute sense. And along with that, along with the Countering Malign Russian Activities and Africa Act, all of these things are connected. There's the hope that Africa never receives full self-determination, just like they're doing with Ukraine. So it's like in the beginning of Obama's term, about 2009, he goes to Ghana and states that Africans should not blame Western colonialism for the problems that exist. And the thing I'd like to discuss here is the politics and myth of representation under capitalism, or identity politics, if you will.
Politics, yes. And I didn't talk about the bill. I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent and didn't answer your question. But yeah, the Black, as we call it, the Black political class, and Congressman Meeks of Queens is the chairperson of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And he sponsored this bill to, Russian malign influence in Africa. The Russians are up to something sneaky and evil. Well, it's the U.S. that has AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, and military bases all over the continent. It's the U.S. that has malign influence in Africa. And African nations are sovereign. They can be friends with Russia. It's none of America's business if they want to be friends with Russia. So it's very insulting to these countries to infantilize them. It's nothing but the white man's burden again, which was often personified by Barack Obama. It was disgraceful. There's so many reasons not to like him, but for him to go to Africa and say Africans can't complain about anything, it was just grotesque to me. But that's what he does. He still works on behalf of the empire. I guess he signed up for the rest of his life, right? But the politics of representation in a capitalist system, that's all you're going to get. You're going to get the likes of Congressman Meeks writing these bills that harm African countries. You're going to get, if you get a Black president, you're going to get a Barack Obama. I remember, most of my life, Black people would debate, could a Black person ever be president? Would it be a Democrat or would it be a Republican or blah, blah, blah. And I remember in this process of political education, I realized, I said, well, even if you could get a Black president, it would end up being somebody you don't want. And was I ever right? Because that's who we got. But, we have to face facts about the electoral system. We have an oligarchy who decides who the presidents are going to be. The only one actually who was outside of that paradigm actually was Trump, ironically. But he went along when they realized he had in fact won. They didn't sit back and let him do what he wanted to do either. So yeah, that's what we have, an electoral system who's going to pick people who are antithetical to our interests, who don't want the things that we should want for ourselves. And that's so you'll get an Obama, you'll get a Joe Biden, there'll be some new horrible person in there in 2024. Biden's not even going to run again. It's clear the donor class doesn't want him. They're whispering now. So you see an article in the New York Times. There are Democrats who don't want Biden to run again. That means the New York Times doesn't want him to run again. And their friends don't want him to run again. And they are busily trying to decide who they can prop up and get in there the next time.
And there's the deeper question, because people supported David Dinkins. They had some hope that the structure would be changed with the presence of David Dinkins. People thought that with Barack Obama, and people thought that in some way about Eric Adams. I know you have done a lot of work on dispelling this myth about Eric Adams. So let's talk about
Oh my
him
God.
for a moment.
He's the worst. I mean, he's stupid. He really is. And we shouldn't we should, not personalize these things, but he's really not smart enough to pull off the things that he's trying to pull off. So he's a former cop. That's all he talks about, is having been a cop. And, the old saying, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So all he talks about is policing. The NYPD has an $11 billion budget. Every other city agency experienced cuts, but not the NYPD. So they cut the education department, they cut the needs for the kids, but the cops still have everything that they want. And he is, it's funny thing, because he's not smart, it's really obvious how bad he is. I don't know, maybe it's then, I shouldn't complain. Maybe it's good that he's dumb, because if he was a smooth talking person, he could probably fool even more people. But he's always talking about crime, and gun violence, guns. And I looked it up. There's actually fewer gun deaths now than there were last year. So his backers, the people who gave him money, who put him in City Hall, are right-wing people. They want to make sure nothing progressive happens, that there's not even a semblance, not even any talk of even phony progressivism, as we saw under Bill de Blasio. And that's who he represents. He is, talk about the evils of representationalism, if that's a word. He is the epitome of what that can mean. So it's a very sad time for this city that this horrible man who represents such horrible interests is the mayor of New York. But we got another Black mayor, right? He's 100 times worse than Dinkins. Dinkins was primarily ineffectual. Dinkins was mayor during the Wall Street downturn in the early 90s, which hurt the city very badly. And there were people who couldn't stand the idea of having a Black mayor, even a milquetoast reformist like David Dinkins. So he failed. And also he, as many people said during the time, even if he was going to be a one-term mayor, he should have just done anything he wanted to do and done what he needed to do for Black people. But people have these jobs, they get these jobs because they have no intention of representing Black people and meeting our needs. That's why they get elected to office. That's why they get appointed to high office. The closer people get to the top, the less likely they are to do what the people need, and the more likely they are to meet the needs of the interests who are, frankly, our enemies. And we can see that with Dinkins and with Eric Adams.
The interesting thing about David Dinkins as well is that he was the one who fueled the Disneyfication of Times Square. I know that Giuliani gets a lot of credit for that, but it was actually David Dinkins who fueled that energy of Disneyfying and gentrifying Times Square. So that's another thing he did. He's talking about the downturn. And so now we see what Times Square looks like.
Yeah, well, they're all in the pocket of these developers and these very wealthy people. So each one builds on what the last one did. So someone like de Blasio, who talked a good game about being progressive, but what did he do? Rezone neighborhood after neighborhood, gentrify neighborhood after neighborhood. Now New York is like a theme park for rich people, is what I call it. And that's, unless there's a mass movement, and how would you change these things? You'd have to have a mass movement to counter it. And it can't be about who's going to be on the ballot the next time around. That is a recipe for more disappointment and more setbacks.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit bigger than who a person is or what they look like, because when Obama first came around, people were not aware of his record as senator. I would emphasize the wiretapping aspect, and people seemingly rationalized why wiretapping was okay just because it was Obama advocating for it. But then there was also Cynthia McKinney who was running. There were other folks who were African who were running. You even had Alan Keyes who was running, who was a Republican, but people like, well, why are you against Obama? You don't want Black people to succeed. And I proceeded to ask people, if it's really just about quote unquote Black people, why wouldn't you vote for a Cynthia McKinney? And they're like, well, I don't know who she is. So it can't simply be about what someone looks like, you don't take the time to research people. And if you continually vote these people in and you're talking about change, you're either comfortable with the position you are personally in, or you're comfortable or okay with the way the country is, and you somehow believe it can be changed. But there are people out there, if it's just about voting for somebody Black. So I don't know if it's simply about that or something more.
Well, for a lot of people, it's a funny thing. When Obama's during his campaign in 2008, there were questions asked. People said, I had never heard of him. I don't know much about him. But when he won the Iowa caucuses and it was obvious that white people would vote for him, then everybody stopped asking questions. It was like, oh, he can win. White people will vote for him. And all of the questions just disappeared overnight. It was very, very sad to see. And, anybody like ourselves who was asking questions about Obama had a hard way to go for the next 8 years. But you're right about this. It's so insidious, this desire to see the Black face in a high place. It goes back to the days of Jim Crow. So we've taken ourselves back. We have devolved back to decades past when that was the only hope we had, that a good Black person would achieve something. And I understand that. And I sometimes feel that myself. But you can't do that with politics. You can't. It's not like wanting a Black person to win an Oscar or win a gold medal in the Olympics. That's not what we're talking about, or it shouldn't be. And of course, racist white people always helped Obama. I thought it was funny. I would see people who just thought about asking a question, and sure enough, some saltine congressman from Nowheresville would call Obama a liar. Rush Limbaugh would say something about him, and people would do a 180 and go right back to propping him up. But that's where the political education comes in. That's where the analysis has to come in.
With the political education aspect, I have one more question for you. January 6th, I know when you say that, it's like people say September 11th. I say the September 11th. I remember is the coup in Chile when Salvador Allende was assassinated. That is the September 11th. I remember when US imperialism took that over. And then Pinochet was supported by the US government. That is what I talk about with September 11th. But anyway, when people talk about particular dates, people now talk about January 6th. That's just a thing. Looking at any sort of political education around the foundation of this country, do you think if there was some aspect of political education where people really seriously looked at, say, the quote, American Revolution, which is, if you ask me, that was the first Brexit. So if people seriously looked at all of the world wars, which were essentially targeting Africa and also targeting the rise of communism around the world. So any war that the US involves itself in has to do with the fall to make sure self-determination doesn't happen around the world. Any sort of keen study on the history of the foundation of this country, do you think people would be surprised at what happened on January 6th? Because that was a massively organized effort. It wasn't just people randomly going to the Capitol and be like, yeah, we want to take back America. It's been organized for years, looking at the foundation of this country, which is white supremacy, which is forced labor, which is the stealing of land. Do you think that people would have seen those connections if political education was of importance in this country?
Sure, they would see all the connections and they wouldn't fall for it. I have a piece in Black Agenda Report, the January 6th scam. The Democrats are using it to, instead of doing what people elected them to do, they hope to just yell the word Trump at, periodically and hopefully get people to vote for them. So January 6th was tailor-made for them. They're having this big hearing and you see what traitors they are. You see these liberals, now they're in love with Liz Cheney, the Republican Senator Dick Cheney's daughter. She should run for president. She's so wonderful. If you're a Democrat, Why do you care who the Republicans run? But that shows you the class nature, if you will, of their politics. It shows you how useless they are to us. There's nothing about January 6th to remember. I mean, it's one of those events that was memorable. I will always remember it. It was one of those things that once you've seen, you can't get out of your mind. But you have to remember a couple of things. It was a white mob. That was, and speaking of Glenn Ford, that was his take. He said, this is what people acted like. This has never happened before. And Glenn reminded us that, white people, when they feel aggrieved, act as a mob and tear things up. And that's exactly what they did. Trump was their guy. He was the openly white president. And so his reporters, went to the Capitol and trashed the place because he told them that he had won. So what does that leave us? We can't fall for this stuff. I have not watched 1 minute of the January 6th hearings. I don't intend to watch it. I don't find it useful. There's nothing about it I want to relive. I don't think that elevating this to some kind of, Americans have this exalted view of their government. It's like, oh, the Capitol, you can't trash the Capitol, without thinking about, as you've just pointed out and talking about September 11th, how the US trashes other countries on a constant basis, coups, interventions, sanctions, all kinds of things that have created havoc throughout the world for millions of people. So some, Trumper yahoos ran amok in the Capitol for a few hours. It's nothing compared to what the US has done all over the world. So that's one thing we should remember. But there's something else that I'm trying to formulate a way to write about this. And that is the fact that liberals or progressives or whatever they call themselves can't get 10 people together to do anything. Why is it the right wing got thousands of people on January 6th to run into the Capitol and riot? And I'm not saying do what they did, but the left does not have that kind of solidarity. Can't even actually, are so confused, they can't even agree on what it is they would protest for or protest against. So I think that's another thing to remember about that day, and the idea the Capitol is some sacred place or any of that other nonsense. And we have to remember, and Trump should go on trial. People, they charge him with what? It's not clear that he did anything illegal that day. And if he was charged, it would just energize these people who we're told are so horrible, who would put him back in office if he ran again. So those are my thoughts on January 6th.
And before we go, do you have any final collection of thoughts for our episode? Also, how can people reach you if they have any questions or if they are interested in finding your work?
Sure. Go to Read Black Agenda Report every week, blackagendareport.com. We have a new issue every Wednesday. We have Black Agenda Radio on Friday, where I interview people, and Black Agenda Radio can be heard on our site, also WBAI. We're going to be heard on WPFW in a few weeks, which is very exciting. You can find my work I'm on Twitter. Freedom Ride Blog is my handle. I have a Patreon, Margaret Kimberley. And if you go on the Black Agenda Report website, you can find my email address. So having said that, I just want to tell everybody, join an organization. I think of all the things that we've talked about, I think that's very important. The right kind of organization, obviously. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
That's funny you say that, because that is how we end every single show. You just ended our show for us, because we say organize, 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 because what? Organization decides everything. And we also have our fellow comrades creating similar content. We have our Ancestors' Voices, the weekly Pan-African News, Revolutionary African Women, as well as the Forward Ever podcast. If you are interested in externally showing the work you do in the struggle for the people's liberation, you can get some shirts and hoodies at the Forward Ever shop. All links will be in the description. Thank you so much, Comrade Margaret, for being here. I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And power to the people.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Power to the people. And as we conclude this episode, we say forward ever, backwards never. Thank you.